recorded by John Lothe and is intended for educational purposes. This recording is not to be sold or distributed for sale. If you wish to support the work and publishing of these recordings, please visit the John Lothe Patreon page. If you come across these recordings anywhere else without my expressed support, and find that they are requesting donations for presenting this work to you, you will not be supporting the creator by doing so. This is just a friendly warning to anyone who may fall prey to predatory practices I have come across recently. Tragedy and Hope: A History of the World in Our Time by Carroll Quigley. Chapter 11. The United States of America. The United States, which presents the most extreme example of financial capitalism, reached monopoly capitalism only in a partial and distorted fashion, and for a very brief period, and has reached the following stage of the pluralist economy only in an unself-conscious and tentative way. From the beginning, the United States had a shortage of labor in the face of an unprecedented richness of resources. As a result, it sought labor-saving devices and high output per man day of work, even in agriculture. This means that the amount of capital equipment per man was usually high throughout American history, even in the earliest period. And this undoubtedly presented a problem in an undeveloped country where private savings were, for many generations, scarce. The accumulation of such savings for investment in labor-saving mechanisms brought an opportunity to financial capitalism at an early date. Accordingly, the United States had financial capitalism over a longer period and in a more extreme form than any other country. Moreover, the size of the country made the problem of transportation so acute that the capital necessary for the early canals, railroads, and iron industry was large and had to be found from sources other than local private persons. Much of it came from government subsidies or from foreign investors. It was observable as early as 1850 and had overseas connections which were still in existence in the 1930s. By the 1880s, the techniques of financial capitalism were well developed in New York and northern New Jersey, and reached levels of corruption which were never approached in any European country. This corruption sought to cheat the ordinary investor by flotations and manipulations of securities for the benefit of insiders. Success in this was its own justification, and the practitioners of these dishonesties were as socially acceptable as their wealth entitled them to be, without any madversions on how that wealth had been obtained. Corrupt techniques associated with the names of Daniel Drew or Jay Gould in the wildest days of railroad financial juggling were also practiced by Morgan and others who became respectable from longer sustained success, which allowed them to build up established firms. Any reform of Wall Street practices came from pressure from the hinterlands, especially from the farming West, and was long delayed by the close alliance of Wall Street with the two major political parties which grew up in 1880 through 1900. In this alliance, by 1900, the influence of Morgan in the Republican Party was dominant, his chief rivalry coming from the influence of a monopoly capitalist, Rockefeller of Ohio. By 1900, Wall Street had largely abandoned the Democratic Party, a shift indicated by the passage of the Whitney family from the Democrats to the Republican inner circles, shortly after they established a family alliance with Morgan. In the same period, the Rockefeller family reversed the ordinary direction of development by shifting from the monopoly fields of petroleum to New York banking circles by way of the Chase National Bank. Soon, family as well as financial alliances grew up among the Morgans, Whitneys, and Rockefellers, chiefly through Payne and Aldrich family connections. For almost 50 years, from 1880 to 1930, Financial capitalism approximated a feudal structure in which two great powers, centered in New York, dominated a number of lesser powers, both in New York and in provincial cities. No description of this structure as it existed in the 1920s can be given in a brief compass, since it infiltrated all aspects of American life, and especially all branches of economic life. At the center were a group of less than a dozen investment banks, which were, at the height of their powers, still unincorporated private partnerships. These included J.P. Morgan, the Rockefeller family, Kuhn, Loeb and Company, Dillon, Reed and Company, Brown Brothers and Harriman, and others. Each of these was linked in organizational or personal relationships with various banks, insurance companies, railroads, utilities, and industrial firms. The result was to form a number of webs of economic power, of which the more important centered in New York, while other provincial groups, allied with these, were to be found in Pittsburgh, Cleveland, Chicago, and Boston. J.P. Morgan worked in close relationship to a group of banks and insurance companies, including the First National Bank of New York, the Guarantee Trust Company, the Bankers Trust, the New York Trust Company, and the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company. The whole nexus dominated a network of business firms which included at least 1/6 of the 200 largest non-financial corporations in American business. Among these were 12 utility companies, 5 or more railroad systems, 13 industrial firms, and at least 5 of the 50 largest banks in the country. The combined assets of these firms were more than $30 billion. They included American Telephone and Telegraph Company, International Telephone and Telegraph, Consolidated Gas of New York, the groups of electrical utilities known as Electric Bond and Share, and as the United Corporation Group, which included Commonwealth and Southern, Public Service of New Jersey, and Columbia Gas and Electric, the New York Central Railway System, the Van Sweringen Railway System, Allegheny, of 9 lines, including Chesapeake and Ohio, Erie, Missouri Pacific, the Nickel Plate, and Pierre Marquette, the Santa Fe, the Northern System of 5 Great Lines, Great Northern, Northern Pacific, Burlington, and others, the Southern Railway, General Electric Company, United States Steel, Phelps Dodge, Montgomery Ward, National Biscuit, Kencott Copper, American Radiator and Standard Sanitary, Continental Oil, Reading Coal and Iron, Baldwin Locomotive, and others. The Rockefeller Group, which was really a monopoly capitalist organization investing only its own profits, functioned as a financial capitalist unit in close cooperation with Morgan. Allied with the country's largest bank, the Chase National, it was involved as an industrial power in the various Standard Oil firms and the Atlantic Refining Company, but it controlled over half the assets of the oil industry, plus the 2 1/3 billion assets in Chase National Bank. Kuhn Loeb was chiefly interested in railroads, where it dominated the Pennsylvania, the Union Pacific, the Southern Pacific, the Milwaukee, the Chicago Northwestern, the Katy, Missouri, Kansas, Texas Railroad Company, and the Delaware and Hudson. It also dominated the Bank of Manhattan and the Western Union Telegraph Company, for a total of almost $11 billion in assets. The Mellon Group, centered in Pittsburgh, dominated Gulf Oil, Koppers, Alcoa, Westinghouse Electric, Union Trust Company, the Mellon National Bank, Jones and Laughlin Steel, American Rolling Mill, Crucible Steel, and other firms for total assets of about $3.3 billion. It had been calculated that the 200 largest non-financial corporations in the United States, plus the 50 largest banks in the mid-1930s, owned 34% of the assets of all industrial corporations, 48% of the assets of all commercial banks, 75% of the assets of all public utilities, and 95% of the assets of all railroads. The total assets of all four classes were almost $100 billion, divided almost equally among the four classes. The four economic power blocks which we have mentioned, Morgan, Rockefeller, Kuhn Loeb and Company, and Mellon, plus DuPont and three local groups allied with these in Boston, Cleveland, and Chicago, together dominated the following percentage of the 250 corporations considered here. Of industrial firms, 58% of their total assets, of railroads, 82%, and utilities, 58%. The aggregate value of the assets controlled by the 8 power groups was about $61,205 million of total assets, of $198,351 million in these 250 largest corporations at the end of 1935. The economic power represented by these figures is almost beyond imagination to grasp, and was increased by the active role which these financial titans took in politics. Morgan and Rockefeller together frequently dominated the National Republican Party, while Morgan occasionally had extensive influence in the National Democratic Party. 3 of the Morgan partners were usually Democrats. These two were also powerful on the state level, especially Morgan in New York and Rockefeller in Ohio. Mellon was a power in Pennsylvania, and DuPont was obviously a political power in Delaware. In the 1920s, this system of economic and political power formed a hierarchy headed by the Morgan interests and played a principal role in both political and business life. Morgan, operating on the international level in cooperation with his allies abroad, especially in England, influenced the events of history to a degree which cannot be specified in detail, but which certainly was tremendous. Nevertheless, the slow developments of business life which we have mentioned were making investment bankers like Morgan obsolete, and the deflationary financial policies of which these bankers insisted were laying the foundations of the economic collapse which ended their rule in general social disaster by 1940. In the United States, however, the demise of financial capitalism was much more protracted than in most foreign countries, and was not followed by a clearly established system of monopoly capitalism. This blurring of the stages was caused by a number of events, of which 3 should be mentioned. 1. The continued personal influence of many financiers and bankers, even after their power had waned. 2. The decentralized condition of the United States itself, especially the federal political system. And 3. The long-sustained political and legal tradition of anti-monopoly going back at least to the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. As a consequence, the United States did not reach a clearly monopolistic economy and was unable to adopt a fully unorthodox financial policy capable of providing full use of resources. Unemployment, which had reached 13 million persons in 1933, was still at 10 million in 1940. On the other hand, the United States did take long steps in the direction of balancing interest blocks by greatly strengthening labor and farm groups, and by sharply curtailing the influence and privileges of finance and heavy industry. Of the diverse groups in the American economy, the financiers were most closely related to heavy industry because of the latter's great need for capital for its heavy equipment. The deflationary policies of the bankers were acceptable to heavy industry, chiefly because the mass labor of heavy industry in the United States, notably in steel and automobile manufacturing, was not unionized, and the slowly declining prices of the products of heavy industry could continue to be produced profitably if costs could be reduced by large-scale elimination of labor by installing more heavy equipment. Much of this new equipment, which led to assembly line techniques such as the continuous strip steel mill, were financed by the bankers. With unorganized labor, the employers of mass labor could rearrange, curtail, or terminate labor without notice on a daily basis, and could thus reduce labor costs to meet falls in prices from bankers' deflation. The fact that reductions in wages or large layoffs in mass employment industries also reduced the volume of purchasing power in the economy as a whole, to the injury of other groups selling consumers' goods, was ignored by the makers of heavy producers' goods. In this way, farmers, light industry, real estate, commercial groups, and other segments of the society were injured by the deflationary policies of the bankers and by the employment policies of heavy industry closely allied to the bankers. When these policies became unbearable in the Depression of 1929 to 1933, these other interest blocs, who had been traditionally Republican, or at least, like the Western farmers, had refused to vote Democratic and had engaged in largely futile third-party movements, deserted the Republican Party, which remained subservient to high finance and heavy industry. This shift of the farm bloc, light industry, commercial interests, notably department stores, real estate, professional people, and mass unskilled labor to the Democratic Party in 1932 resulted in the election of Franklin D. Roosevelt and the New Deal. The new administration sought to curtail the power of the two opposition and exploiting groups, bankers and heavy industry, and to reward and help the groups which had elected it. The farmers were helped by subsidies, labor was helped by government spending to make jobs and provide purchasing power, and by encouragement of unionization, while real estate, professional people, and commercial groups were helped by the increasing demand from the increased purchasing power of farmers and labor. The New Deal's action against finance and heavy industry were chiefly aimed at preventing these two from ever repeating their actions of the 1920 to 1933 period. The Securities Exchange Act, or SEC Act, sought to supervise securities issues and stock exchange practices to protect investors. Railroad legislation sought to reduce the financial exploitation and even the deliberate bankruptcy of railroads by financial interests, as William Rockefeller had done to the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul, or as Morgan had done to the New York, New Haven, and Hartford. The Banking Act of 1933 separated investment banking from deposit banking. The wholesale manipulation of labor by heavy industry was curtailed by the National Labor Relations Act of 1933, which sought to protect labor's rights of collective bargaining. At the same time, with the blessings of the new administration, a drive was made by labor groups allied with it to unionize the masses of unskilled labor employed by heavy industry, and to prevent the latter from adopting any policy of mass layoffs or sharp and sudden wage reductions in any future period of decreasing demand. To this end, a Committee for Industrial Organization was set up under the leadership of the one head of a mass labor union in the country, John L. Lewis, of the United Mine Workers, and a drive was put on to organize the workers of the steel, automobile, electrical, and other industries which had no unions. All this served to create more highly organized and more self-conscious interest blocs in American life, especially among farmers and labor. But it did not represent any victory for unorthodox financing, the real key to either monopoly capitalism or to a managed pluralist economy. The reason for this was that the New Deal, because of President Roosevelt, was fundamentally orthodox in its ideas on the nature of money. Roosevelt was quite willing to unbalance the budget and to spend in a depression in an unorthodox fashion because he had grasped the idea that lack of purchasing power was the cause of the lack of demand, which made unsold goods and unemployment. But he had no idea of the causes of the depression and had quite orthodox ideas on the nature of money. As a result, his administration treated the symptoms rather than the causes of the depression. And, while spending unorthodoxly to treat these symptoms, did so with money borrowed from the banks in the accepted fashion. The New Deal allowed the bankers to create the money, borrowed it from the banks, and spent it. This meant that the New Deal ran up the national debt to the credit of the banks and spent money in such a limited fashion that no drastic reemployment of idle resources was possible. One of the most significant facts about the New Deal was its orthodoxy on money. For the whole 12 years he was in the White House, Roosevelt had statutory power to issue fiat money in the form of greenbacks printed by the government without recourse to the banks. This authority was never used. As a result of such orthodoxy, the Depression's symptoms of idle resources were overcome only when the emergency of the war in 1942 made it possible to justify a limitless increase in the national debt by limitless borrowing from private persons and the banks. But the whole episode showed a failure to grasp the nature of money and the function of the monetary system, of which considerable traces remained in the post-war period. One reason for the New Deal's readiness to continue with an orthodox theory of the nature of money, along with an unorthodox practice in its use, arose from the failure of the Roosevelt administration to recognize the nature of the economic crisis itself. This failure can be seen in Roosevelt's theory of pump priming. He sincerely believed, as did his Secretary of the Treasury, that there was nothing structurally wrong with the economy, that it was simply temporarily stalled, and would keep going of its own powers if it could be restarted. In order to restart it, all that was needed, in New Deal theory, was a relatively moderate amount of government spending on a temporary basis. This would create purchasing power, demand, for consumers' goods, which in turn would increase the confidence of investors, who would begin to release large unused savings into investment. This would, again, create additional purchasing power and demand, and the economic system would take off of its own power. The curtailment of the powers of finance and heavy industry would then prevent any repetition of the collapse of 1929. The inadequacy of this theory of the Depression was shown in 1937, when the New Deal, after 4 years of pump priming and a victorious election in 1936, stopped its spending. Instead of taking off, the economy collapsed in the steepest recession in history. The New Deal had to resume its treatment of symptoms, but now without hope that the spending program could ever be ended. A hopeless prospect, since the administration lacked the knowledge of how to reform the system, or even how to escape from borrowing bank credit with its mounting public debt. And the administration lacked the courage to adopt the really large-scale spending necessary to give full employment of resources. The administration was saved from its impasses by the need for the rearmament program, followed by the war. Since 1947, the Cold War and the space program have allowed the same situation to continue, so that even today, prosperity is not the result of a properly organized economic system, but of government spending. And any drastic reduction in such spending would give rise to an acute depression.